In 1976, one company in upstate New York controlled 90% of every roll of film sold in the United States and 85% of every camera. Not market leadership, not a strong quarter. 90%. Think about what that means. Walk into any pharmacy, any grocery store, any department store from Maine to California, and there it was. That yellow box, sitting on the shelf like it owned the place, because it did. Walk into any American home with children between 1960 and 1996, and there was a near certain chance you'd find one. In the kitchen junk drawer, on the shelf next to the television, tucked into the bag your mother packed for vacation. That yellow box, those orange letters, that name, Kodak, stamped onto the most important moments of your life before you were old enough to understand what a moment was. They shot the moon landings on Kodak film. Every frame of footage from Apollo 11, from the boot print in the lunar dust to the pale marble of Earth hanging in black space. Kodak. They shot Gone with the Wind on Kodak film. The Wizard of Oz, your parents' wedding, your grandparents' wedding, the photograph on your grandmother's mantle of a man in a uniform you never got to meet. Kodak. National Geographic built its visual legacy on Kodak film. Hollywood ran on it. The United States government ran a secret operation through a Kodak factory in Rochester, New York, processing reconnaissance satellite images for the CIA. Images that showed where the Soviets had their tanks, and their missiles, and their troops. Hundreds of Kodak workers with security clearances, developing photographs taken from space. The Cold War, in part, was won inside a camera factory. The company employed 145,000 people worldwide. In Rochester alone, one mid-sized city in upstate New York, 62,000 workers showed up to Kodak every day. If you lived in Rochester, you worked for Kodak, or your father did, or your grandfather did. Journalist Kurt Gerling wrote that Kodak employees existed as a separate class, that from infancy, children were impressed with the fact that daddy is a Kodak man. It wasn't employment, it was identity, it was inheritance. 3 generations deep, Kodak was the architecture of an entire city. By 1996, the company was pulling in $16 billion in annual revenue. The stock peaked at $94 a share. Kodak was ranked one of the 4 most valuable brands on Earth, behind Disney, Coca-Cola, and McDonald's. 4 brands, the entire planet, and Kodak was one of them. Then something went catastrophically, irreversibly, infuriatingly wrong. January 19th, 2012. Eastman Kodak Company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in a federal courthouse in Manhattan. $6.75 billion in debt. The 62,000 Rochester workers were gone, reduced first to 50,000, then 30,000, then 15,000, then a few thousand more. An 810,000 square foot Kodak building, a building that once processed spy satellite images for the United States government, was demolished in 35 days to make room for an Amazon warehouse. 90 trucks a day, hauling out the rubble, from Kodak to Amazon in 35 days. And in 2013, the companies that had spent the previous decade eating Kodak's market alive, Apple, Google, Amazon, Facebook, Microsoft, Samsung, bought Kodak's own patents at the bankruptcy auction. 1,100 digital imaging patents. Kodak had hoped to recover $4.5 billion. They received $525 million. The companies that destroyed them bought the evidence for cents on the dollar. This is the story of how one fatherless bank clerk, working nights in his mother's kitchen, invented a technology that changed what it means to be human. How that invention became the most dominant imaging empire the world had ever seen. A company so powerful, it shaped the visual memory of the entire 20th century. And how the men who inherited that empire looked at the technology that would replace them. Looked at it directly, clearly, with full understanding of what it meant, and chose to bury it anyway. This isn't just about cameras. It isn't just about film going obsolete, or a company that was too slow to adapt, or the inevitable disruption of an industry by technology. Those are the easy answers, and they're wrong. Here's the thing. Kodak didn't fail to see the future. Kodak invented the future. A Kodak engineer built the world's first digital camera in 1975 in a Kodak lab, on Kodak's time, and Kodak's management told him to keep his mouth shut. 134 years from a bank clerk mixing chemicals in his mother's kitchen to the most powerful imaging company on earth, to a bankruptcy auction where Silicon Valley bought the wreckage. They invented the future. Then they buried it. And the future buried them. Welcome to Kodak Park. 1,200 acres in Rochester, New York. Once the largest single industrial complex in the world. It had its own power plant, its own fire department, its own railroad. The ashes of its founder are buried somewhere on these grounds. Not in a cemetery, but in the industrial park he built with nothing but obsession and time. Most of those 1,200 acres sit quiet now. The Hawkeye plant, 759,000 square feet of factory Art Deco architecture, sitting on a cliff above the Genesee River Gorge, has been vacant since 2011. It costs over $1 million a year just to heat it. A lone custodian walks the corridors. The building has been auctioned 3 times since 2018. No one has bought it. This is where it happened. All of it. The invention, the domination, the burial, the collapse. Let's go inside. George Eastman was born on July 12, 1854, in a village called Waterville, New York, into the kind of circumstances that either break people or forge them into something harder than ordinary. His father, George Washington Eastman, ran a business college in Rochester. Then his father died. George was 7 years old. The college collapsed. The family's money was gone. His mother, Maria, took in boarders to keep the house. She scrubbed floors and cooked meals for strangers so her children could eat. George watched all of this. He dropped out of school at 14. Not because he wanted to, because there was no other choice. He was the man of the house now. A 14-year-old boy with a dead father, a struggling mother, and 2 older sisters depending on him. His first job paid $3 a week as an office messenger. $3. He took it without complaint and showed up every day. He was serious, methodical, careful with money in the way that only people who have watched it disappear can be. He worked his way through 2 insurance firms and then landed a job as a junior clerk at the Rochester Savings Bank in 1874. He studied accounting at home at night after his shifts so he could earn more. He saved everything. He spent nothing on himself except one thing: photography. In 1877, a colleague suggested Eastman bring a camera on an upcoming vacation. He bought the equipment. He never took the trip, but he didn't return the camera either. He became completely, obsessively consumed by the chemistry of it. The silver emulsions, the glass plates, the elaborate portable darkroom that photographers of the era had to haul into the field just to capture a single image. A camera in 1877 wasn't a device. It was a laboratory. You needed a dark tent, a nitrate bath, a water container, heavy glass plates, a wooden camera the size of a small suitcase. Photography was the exclusive domain of professionals and the extraordinarily patient. Eastman decided that was a problem worth solving. He began running experiments in his mother's kitchen after his bank shifts ended. Nights and weekends for 3 years, mixing photographic emulsions on the same table where his mother served boarders their supper. He spent nearly all of his savings. He patented a dry plate coating machine in England in 1879, received the American patent in 1880, and leased the third floor of a building on State Street in Rochester to begin manufacturing. One of his first equipment purchases was a second-hand engine. "I really needed only a 1 horsepower," he later recalled. "This was a 2 horsepower, but I thought perhaps business would grow up to it." It did. In 1881, with a small investment from a Rochester businessman named Henry Strong, Eastman formed the Eastman Dry Plate Company. Later that year, he resigned from the bank. He was 27 years old, and he had just bet everything on himself. 7 years later, in 1888, he introduced the Kodak camera. Preloaded with enough roll film for 100 exposures. Priced at $25. The photographer pointed it, pressed the button, and sent the entire camera back to Rochester when the film was finished. Eastman's company developed the prints, reloaded the camera, and mailed everything back, all for $10. He coined the slogan himself: "You press the button, we do the rest." Within a year, it was one of the most recognized phrases in America. Think about what Eastman actually did. Photography had existed for nearly 50 years when he entered the field. It had been the exclusive territory of professionals for all 50 of them. Eastman handed it to an 8-year-old child. He handed it to a factory worker, a school teacher, a farm wife in Kansas, who had never stood in a darkroom in her life. For the first time in human history, ordinary people could capture their own memories and keep them. He didn't just build a camera. He changed the relationship between human beings and time. By 1889, Eastman introduced transparent roll film, the foundational technology that made motion pictures possible. Thomas Edison needed that film. Hollywood needed it. Without the roll of celluloid Eastman developed in a Rochester factory, there is no cinema. None of it. Not the silence, not the talkies, not Casablanca, not the moon landing footage, not any of it. By 1896, Kodak was the leading supplier of film internationally. By 1915, the company employed more than 8,000 people in Rochester alone and posted annual earnings of $15.7 million. From a 3-a-week office boy to the most consequential figure in the history of photography, he did it in less than 2 decades. Here's what you need to understand about George Eastman, because it matters for everything that comes later. He was not a man who protected what he had built. He was a man who kept building. He established profit sharing for all employees in 1912, the first major American company to do so. He created sick pay, disability compensation, and pensions before those concepts had common names. He donated more than $100 million during his lifetime to the University of Rochester, to MIT, to Tuskegee, to Hampton University, to dental clinics in London and across Europe for low-income patients who had never seen a dentist. He built the Eastman School of Music. He built the Rochester Philharmonic. He built a medical school. He gave away most of what he made to the city that made him, and he supervised every gift personally. In the final years of his life, a degenerative spinal condition left him in constant, escalating pain. On March 14, 1932, at the age of 77, George Eastman sat down and wrote a note to his friends. It read, "My work is done. Why wait?" He folded it, placed it on his bedside table, and shot himself in the heart. He died precise and deliberate to the end. Unsentimental, practical. The work was finished. There was no reason to linger. The empire he had built from a kitchen workbench and a dead father's debt would survive him by 80 years. His ashes would be buried, not in a cemetery, but on the grounds of the industrial park he created. And the men who came after him, the managers, the executives, the professional inheritors of everything he built, would one day look at the future he would have recognized instantly and chosen immediately, and they would bury that too. But that is decades away. In 1932, the empire is intact. The yellow box is everywhere, and the greatest years are still ahead. George Eastman was born on July 12, 1854, in a village called Waterville, New York, 20 miles southwest of Utica, in the kind of upstate that nobody thinks about, and nobody leaves easily. His father died when he was 7. Not a slow death, not a long illness. There one day, gone the next, and the family left with nothing but the debts he carried. His mother took in boarders to survive. George had 2 older sisters, one of them crippled by polio. He was the youngest child in a household held together by a woman who had no other options. At 14, he dropped out of school. Not because he wanted to, because somebody had to work. His first job paid $3 a week. Office boy at an insurance firm. He was methodical, quiet, serious in a way that made people underestimate him. The kind of boy who filed things correctly and stayed late and never needed to be asked twice. Within a year, he had taught himself enough to be promoted. Then he moved to a second insurance firm and did it again. He studied accounting at night, at home, after a full day on someone else's clock, because he understood that the only way out was to make himself worth more than $3 a week. By 1874, at 20 years old, George Eastman was a junior clerk at the Rochester Savings Bank. He rose to bookkeeper. He was careful with money, his own and everyone else's. And he spent almost nothing except on the one hobby that had seized him completely: photography. A colleague suggested he bring a camera on a trip to the Mackinac Islands in 1877. Eastman bought the equipment. He never made the trip, but he got the camera onto his workbench and never put it down. Here's the thing about photography in the 1870s. It was a punishment. A dark tent, a nitrate bath, glass plates, a heavy tripod, a portable laboratory that weighed as much as a small man. You didn't take a photograph. You performed a procedure. And when the chemicals spilled on your clothes, as they inevitably did, they ruined everything they touched. Eastman found this offensive. Not the inconvenience of it, the waste, the unnecessary difficulty. He believed that if something could be made simpler, it should be. And he believed that belief with the ferocity of someone who had never been allowed to waste a single resource in his life. He spent 3 years in his mother's kitchen after work, experimenting with gelatin emulsions on glass plates. 3 years. Every evening, every weekend, burning through his own savings in a kitchen that wasn't designed for chemistry. In 1879, he patented a dry plate coating machine in England. In 1880, the American patent followed. He leased the 3rd floor of a building on State Street in Rochester. His first purchase was a second-hand engine and began manufacturing photographic plates for sale. He was 26 years old. A businessman named Henry Strong believed in him enough to invest. On January 1st, 1881, the Eastman Dry Plate Company was formed. That same year, Eastman resigned from the Rochester Savings Bank, the institution that had given him stability, that had been the ceiling of what a fatherless boy from a boarding house household could expect, and devoted himself entirely to making photography simple enough for anyone. What followed was a cascade of inventions so rapid, it's worth slowing down to look at each one. In 1884, flexible paper film replaced the glass plates, the first time photography became portable in any real sense. In 1888, the Kodak camera. $25, preloaded with enough film for 100 exposures. You pressed the button. You sent the whole camera back to Rochester with $10. And Rochester sent you back your prints and a reloaded camera. You press the button, we do the rest. Eastman wrote that slogan himself. He also bought the advertising space himself. He understood that the invention and the sale of the invention were the same project. Then, in 1889, transparent roll film, cellulose-based, flexible, light-sensitive. The invention that made motion pictures possible. Thomas Edison came to Eastman for film when he was building his motion picture camera. So did every director in Hollywood who followed him. The entire visual language of the 20th century ran on the material George Eastman figured out in his mother's kitchen. By 1896, Kodak was the leading supplier of film internationally. By 1915, it was the largest employer in Rochester, more than 8,000 workers, annual earnings of $15.7 million. A man who had started at $3 a week had built the infrastructure of human memory, and he gave most of it away. More than $100 million over the course of his life, to the University of Rochester, to MIT, to the Eastman School of Music, to dental clinics for children in 5 countries. He once wrote a check for $20 million to the University of Rochester and listed the donor as Mr. Smith. He didn't want to fuss. He funded historically black universities in the South when that was not a fashionable thing for a wealthy white industrialist to do. He built Rochester into a city worth living in because he believed the city was his responsibility. There is a version of this story where you're meant to appreciate the irony. A great man, a great company, a great fall. But there is nothing ironic about George Eastman. He was exactly what he appeared to be. He earned every dollar he made. He gave away nearly everything he had. He built something that should have lasted forever. On March 14th, 1932, at the age of 77, George Eastman sat down at his desk in the mansion he had built in Rochester and shot himself in the chest. He left a note on his bedside table. It read, "To my friends, my work is done. Why wait?" 4 words, the work of a man who had been outrunning death since he was 14. George Eastman built something from nothing, a fatherless boy, a boarding house kitchen, a second-hand engine, and turned it into the visual archive of an entire civilization. He would be dead before the empire reached its absolute peak, and he wouldn't be there when it started to rot. The men who came after him inherited something they had not built and could not fully comprehend. A family legacy doesn't guarantee competent leadership. Blood relation doesn't transfer obsession. In 1900, the Eastman Kodak Company released a camera called the Brownie. It cost $1. $1. At a time when a factory laborer earned less than $2 for a full day's work, Kodak put a camera in the hands of a child. That was the point. The Brownie was named after the popular cartoon sprites from children's stories of the era, and it was marketed directly to children because Eastman understood something that his competitors hadn't yet grasped. The customer he wanted wasn't the professional photographer with a studio and a darkroom. The customer he wanted was everyone else. The mother recording her children's birthday. The soldier with a pocket camera before he shipped out. The family standing in front of a new house. The ordinary human being trying to hold on to something before it disappeared. For the first time in human history, ordinary people could preserve their own memories. Think about what that means. Before the Brownie, photography belonged to professionals and the wealthy. It was a formal act, a sitting, a portrait. Your image existed only if someone important enough had decided to record it. The Brownie ended that. For $1, you were the author of your own visual record. Eastman had not simply invented a cheaper camera. He had democratized the act of remembering. The Brownie sold by the millions. The film it used, which Kodak also sold at 15 cents a roll, sold by the hundreds of millions. And this is where the business model that would define Kodak for the next century crystallized into its final, brilliant, and ultimately fatal form. The camera was almost free. The profit was in the film. Every Brownie sold was a customer committed to buying Kodak film for the life of the camera. Eastman understood this before most people understood what a business model was. Sell the razor cheap. Sell the blades forever. By 1935, the model had expanded into color. Kodachrome, a 2-color process developed by Eastman's chemists and released in 1935 as the first commercially viable color film, redefined what photography could be. Not just a record of what happened, a record of what it looked like, what color the dress was, what the light was doing that afternoon, what a human face actually contained. National Geographic built its visual legacy on Kodachrome. Hollywood ran on it. Gone with the Wind, The Wizard of Oz, Casablanca, every frame of every film that shaped how a generation understood the world. NASA shot the moon landings on Kodak film, the boot print in the lunar dust. The Earth rising over the lunar horizon, that photograph, the one you have seen 1,000 times. That one image that made an entire species feel small and precious simultaneously. Kodak film. Kodachrome remained in production for 74 years. 74 years of continuous production, which is not a product lifespan. It's a dynasty. And then came the Instamatic, 1963. An easy load camera with a drop-in film cartridge. No threading, no fumbling, just click and shoot. Kodak sold 50 million Instamatics in the first 7 years. 50 million in 7 years. The Instamatic didn't just sell cameras, it trained an entire generation to think of photography as effortless, as automatic, as a reflex rather than a deliberate act. You didn't prepare to take a photograph, you just took it. The Kodak moment was already a behavior before it was ever a slogan. The campaign itself came in the 1970s, and it was a masterwork. The Kodak moment. Not a product feature, not a technical specification, an emotion, a philosophy. The idea that certain moments in life demanded to be captured, that failure to capture them was a form of loss, and that Kodak was the instrument of preservation. The campaign ran for 2 decades. The phrase entered the language. It is still used today by people who have never touched a roll of film and couldn't identify a yellow box if it sat on their kitchen table. That's how deep it went. But here is what nobody said out loud at the time, and what the evidence makes clear in retrospect. The Kodak Moment campaign was brilliant marketing built on a dangerous foundation. Kodak had spent decades training its customers to be emotionally dependent on the act of film photography, on the ritual of it, on the anticipation of dropping off a roll and waiting days to see what you had captured, on the physical print you held in your hands. The emotion was real. The loyalty was real. But it was loyalty to an experience, not to a technology. And experiences can be replicated. Technologies get replaced. Kodak had not noticed the difference. Or rather, and this is the part that matters, they had chosen not to notice. Now. There is something else about Kodak in this era that almost nobody discusses. Something that gets buried under the consumer narrative of birthday photos and beach vacations. During the Cold War, the Hawkeye plant, that 759,000 square foot factory Art Deco building sitting on a cliff above the Genesee River Gorge in Rochester, was processing reconnaissance satellite images for the Central Intelligence Agency. The Corona Reconnaissance Satellite Program. Hundreds of Kodak workers with federal security clearances, developing photographs taken from orbit, images that showed where Soviet forces were positioned, where the missiles were pointed, where the factories were building what. The information that drove American strategic planning for decades ran through a camera factory in upstate New York. The workers couldn't tell their spouses what they did. Some of them carried that secret for 40 years. So understand the full weight of what Kodak was at its peak. It wasn't just a consumer brand. It wasn't just nostalgia and yellow boxes. It was the visual infrastructure of American civilization. Commercial, cultural, military. The photographs that made you feel things, and the photographs that kept you alive, were both coming out of the same industrial complex in Rochester. That building, the Hawkeye plant, has been vacant since 2011. It costs over $1 million a year just to heat it. The county is owed $260,000 in back taxes. It went to auction in October 2024. No buyers. By the mid-1970s, Kodak had reached a level of market control that no company in any industry achieves by accident or luck. It is achieved by being right, relentlessly, consecutively, for decades. In Rochester today, the Kodak Tower is discussed more often in the context of its falcons than its former occupant. The apex predator has moved in. The apex brand has moved out. The building that George Eastman built taller than everything else, so that nothing could overshadow it, is now most famous for the birds that have claimed its pinnacle. Kodak technically still uses the tower as a corporate headquarters. For a company that now employs roughly 4,500 people worldwide and earns less than $1 billion in revenue, less than what the film division alone was earning in a single quarter at the peak, the address carries a weight that the business beneath it can no longer justify. Then there is Kodak Park itself, or rather Eastman Business Park, which is what they renamed it after the bankruptcy. 1,200 acres, the largest single industrial complex in the world at peak, its own power plant, its own fire department, its own railroad. Today, portions of it are leased to smaller companies. Light manufacturing, logistics operations, the miscellaneous tenants that occupy the margins of great industrial properties after the great industry has left. The rest of it is quiet. The buildings stand. Some are maintained, some are not. And somewhere on these 1,200 acres, not in a cemetery, not in a mausoleum, not in a place that invites pilgrimage or marks itself as sacred, the ashes of George Eastman are buried. The man who built all of this from nothing, who dropped out of school at 14 to support his mother, who taught himself chemistry at night while working a bank clerk's day shift, who invented roll film and the Brownie camera and Kodachrome and the modern photography industry and the slogan that people still use when they want to describe an unrepeatable moment. His ashes are in the ground of the industrial park he built, in a city that still bears the marks of his generosity, surrounded by buildings that are vacant or demolished or populated by falcons. This is what remains, not the photographs. The photographs survive, billions of them, in albums and archives and attics and digital scans of prints that were made on Kodak paper developed in Kodak chemistry by machines manufactured in Kodak. Factories. The photographs are everywhere. It is the company that made them that is gone. The ruins speak, but the lessons haven't been stated yet, not explicitly. That's what the autopsy is for. Here is what the evidence proves, not what commentators have suggested, not what business school professors debate. What the documented, specific, unambiguous record of Eastman Kodak Company demonstrates over the span of 124 years, from a man mixing chemistry in his mother's kitchen to a bankruptcy auction in Manhattan, where Apple and Google divided the proceeds. 4 lessons, 4 verdicts, each one supported by facts already in the record. Lesson 1. Inventing the future is not enough. You have to be willing to build it. In 1975, a Kodak engineer built the world's first digital camera inside a Kodak laboratory on Kodak's time. In 1977, Kodak filed the patent. By 1981, Kodak's own market intelligence operation had issued a report confirming that digital would replace film within 10 years. Kodak had the invention. Kodak had the patent. Kodak had the warning. Kodak had the capital. $5 billion in annual film revenue at 70% margins, the most durable profit engine in American consumer industry. Kodak had more runway than nearly any company in the history of capitalism has been given to manage a technological transition. They chose the margin. That choice was not irrational in the short term. It was catastrophic in the long term. And here's the thing that makes it irredeemable. It was not ignorance. It was not a failure of intelligence or technology or resources. It was a failure of institutional will. The willingness to bet against yourself while you are winning, which is the only moment you actually have the leverage to make the bet. By the time the margin was gone, so was the leverage, and so was everything else. Inventing the future and burying it is not innovation. It is sabotage. Slow, well-funded, internally approved sabotage. Lesson 2. You cannot protect a revenue stream by ignoring what replaces it. Kodak's film business generated gross margins approaching 70 cents on every dollar. Digital photography, when it arrived at consumer scale, carried margins in the single digits. The mathematics were not subtle. You cannot replace a 70% margin business with a 5% margin business and maintain the same cost structure, the same 62,000 workers, the same 1,200-acre complex, the same pension obligations, the same debt load. It cannot be done. The numbers do not work. Kodak knew this. The Baraba report in 1981 had made the math explicit. The response was to protect the margin for as long as possible, rather than use it to fund the transition to a different cost structure while there was still time. By 2005, Kodak had reached number 1 in U.S. digital camera sales, $5.7 billion in digital revenue. And it didn't matter, because the margin was gone. Revenue without margin is not a business. It is a very expensive waiting room. The film business was always going to die. The question was whether Kodak would spend its last years of margin building something that could survive film's death, or protecting margin until the margin ran out. They chose the second option, and the second option has only one ending. Lesson 3. Legacy is not a strategy. For decades, Kodak had been one of the 4 most valuable brands in the world. The name on the box carried a weight that no competitor could buy or manufacture. The loyalty was real. The trust was real. Generations of American families had organized their most important memories around Kodak's products. That is not sentiment. That is a genuine competitive asset, and Kodak had more of it than almost any consumer company in history. It did not protect them. Brand loyalty is loyalty to an experience. When the experience changed, when digital photography became easier and cheaper and more immediate than film, the loyalty evaporated. Not because consumers were fickle, because the Kodak moment was always about preserving memory, and once digital preserved memory better than film, there was nothing left to be loyal to. The brand had been built on a promise. When a competitor kept that promise better, the brand became irrelevant. Kodak's management spent the 1990s and early 2000s treating the brand as a shield, a reason the market would wait for them, a reason competitors couldn't take their customers. The brand was real. The shield was an illusion. Legacy is not a strategy. It is a balance in an account that you can either invest or spend. Kodak spent it. Lesson 4. Workers always pay for executive mistakes. This is the lesson that business school lectures skip. Not because it's untrue, the evidence is overwhelming, but because it is an uncomfortable conclusion that implicates people who are not typically the subject of business school lectures. The 62,000 Kodak workers in Rochester at peak had nothing to do with the decision in 1975 to bury Stephen Sassen's camera. They were not in the room. They had no vote. They had organized their financial lives, their mortgages, their children's educations, their retirement calculations, around the reasonable assumption that a company employing 1 in 7 Rochester residents, a company whose 13% turnover rate proved its workers chose to stay, a company that had been a cornerstone of American industry for a century, would be there. Because it had always been there. Because the city had been built around the premise of its permanence. By 2012, That number in Rochester had fallen below 7,000. Let that sink in. 62,000 to 7,000. Not because the workers had made bad decisions, not because they had failed to perform, because the people in the boardrooms above them had made a series of decisions across 30 years. Bury the digital camera, file away the warning report, miss the Olympics, spend $925 million on a patent lawsuit, use a photo to sell ink. And the people who paid were the ones who had been doing their jobs correctly the whole time. This is not unique to Kodak. This is the consistent, documented, uncontested pattern of every major corporate failure. The executives collect the compensation during the rise. The workers absorb the consequences during the fall. The executives who made the decisions that destroyed Kodak are not in Rochester anymore. The workers who had no part in those decisions largely are. That asymmetry is not an accident. It is the architecture of the system. Kodak is not a cautionary tale about one company's failure. Kodak is a case study in how that system operates, who decides, who benefits, who pays, and why the people who pay are almost never the people who decided. George Eastman was born in 1854 into a household held together by a woman with no options. He dropped out of school at 14. He taught himself chemistry at night while working someone else's day. He built something from a second-hand engine and a third-floor workshop that became the visual archive of an entire civilization. He gave away most of what he made. He believed the city was his responsibility. He built Rochester into something worth living in. The ashes of that man are somewhere in the industrial park that bears a different name now. And on the cliff above the Genesee River Gorge, 759,000 square feet of empty building sits accumulating back taxes, waiting for a buyer who hasn't come. The question for every company, every executive, every board of directors is not whether disruption is coming. It is always coming. The question is whether you will be the company that invents it and then actually builds it, or the company that invents it files the patent and waits to be destroyed by the version someone else was willing to build. Kodak knew the answer. They invented it in 1975. They just refused to live in it. If your company is currently protecting a margin instead of funding its own replacement, the Hawkeye plant is available. Heated at $1 million a year, waiting for someone to find a use for it. No one has yet. Every company sitting on a profitable product right now and quietly hoping the thing that threatens it just doesn't arrive. This is where that strategy ends. What companies do you see making the same calculation today? Let me know in the comments. If you want more stories of how empires are built and how they fall, subscribe. There are more of them than you'd think, and the patterns are always the same. Thanks for watching.